All right, good evening, everybody. And once again, thank you for joining us tonight. I want to dedicate tonight's class to a colleague of mine who was murdered this past week in Abu Dhabi. His name was Rabbi Tzvi Kogan, and especially came, as a real blow as this coming weekend, please God, be getting together with all my colleagues in New York from around the world. 4,500 Chabad rabbis from around the world will be getting together for this weekend, as we do annually. So it was a pretty tough one. So we'd like to dedicate tonight's class in his honor. And may we come to a time where there'll be no more evil in this world, no more pain, no more suffering, a time of peace and prosperity for all. Okay, well, on the notion of peace, let's get to the subject of tonight's class. And that is, in the process of nurturing our relationships, we got to deal with disagreements. They tell the story of some shul in some small town somewhere in Europe. It's Shavuos. They're about to read the 10 Commandments, and they just hired a new rabbi because the previous rabbi is a little bit older, can't make it to synagogue anymore, can't make it to shul. So they hired a new rabbi, and they're right about to start reading the 10 Commandments. And all of a sudden, a little disagreement in the back of shul breaks out, and half the shul is saying, we're supposed to stand for the 10 Commandments. The other half is saying, no, we sit. And it's an all-out war, stand, sit, stand, sit. So the young rabbi says, what's going on? So explain it to him. He says, you know what? Let's all go together and ask the previous rabbi. So they walk to the previous rabbi's home. It's a mile walk from the shul. They come to his house, open the door. He's laying there in his recliner. They said, Rabbi, do we sit or do we stand? He says, I can't remember. I can't remember what it was like. And one of the sides goes, see, the rabbi says we sit. The other guy says, no, see, he said he would stand. And again, they start fighting. And he says, no, this is how we did it. See, there's something about arguing. There's something about disagreeing. As the classic statement, as classic saying goes, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Right? Now, the reality is disagreements are a challenge to all relationships. And as we have been going throughout the different lessons, right, we have our different types of relationships, and the disagreements can become in many different. So if you turn to page 95, we have some examples. In the circle of intimacy, when you can have a disagreement between spouses regarding spending habits, budgeting priorities, saving goals, can argue about splitting up the house chores and labor, whether it's diet, eating habits. You have parents who disagree how to discipline their children, educational philosophies. You have screen rules, right? Screen time rules. How long can the kids have an iPad? When should the kids get an iPad? At what age should your kid get a cell phone? And they'll have disagreements. Or you have siblings. And this comes up all the time, especially when it comes to siblings who have to take care of aging parents. And there's great disagreement. So as we see, and even in the closest of relationships, you can have these disagreements. And then for sure, a little bit out of that circle, although I'm not sure which one is harder, the disagreements we have with those closest to us or those a little bit further. But once again, these disagreements come up. You have members of a synagogue disagreeing how to allocate the funds. You have business partners on whether we should take bigger risks or minimize the risks. How should we go about that? And these things will constantly come up. We'll have neighbors who will be arguing over politics, although it seems like usually we just let the yard signs do the talking. But disagreements are everywhere. It's like they tell the story of the money collector who was going around town knocking on doors. And he comes to one house and he hears the husband and wife are arguing. And he just hears that the muffled voices through the door, but they're arguing. And he knocks on the door. Here's a voice on the other side. Yes. He says, I'd like to speak. He says, I'm here to collect money. He says, who are you looking for? The master of the house. They said, perfect. We're arguing about that right now. Why don't you come and help us settle it? All right. So that's what we're going to explore tonight. How do we navigate these arguments? But before we get to it, we do need to make a few disclaimers of what we are not here to talk about. We are not here to discuss issues of betrayal, Betrayals will happen, when somebody acts dishonestly, when somebody slanders you. These are not issues of disagreements. These are issues of real pain, real betrayal. We will be discussing such issues in lesson number 6. So you're going to have to hold off for that. And another area that we're not discussing is areas of moral deficiency. And that is, if a spouse has an addiction problem, if somebody in our lives has moral shortcomings or exhibits anger and the likes, how do we deal with those relationships and those situations? That's not an issue of disagreement. That's a real issue that has to be dealt with. Otherwise, we'll be touching on that idea, both in lesson 4 and lesson 5. So you'll have to hold off for that. What we will be discussing tonight is the concept of disagreeing itself. It's more of an ideological idea. It's almost like a soft start to the real areas of disagreement. So tonight's a little soft start for those lessons, but also on its own to appreciate the concept of just being able to disagree without being disagreeable. So what are we going to be doing tonight? First, we're going to start off with a little bit of myth busting. We're going to explore some myths related to the concept of disagreement. And like I said, we're going to call the Ghostbusters. I mean, the Mythbusters. Now, after we do that, we're going to dive a little bit deeper and understand the Torah's approach to the concept of disagreeing, how to understand it a little bit better, and then we'll conclude with some practical takeaways that we can all walk away with utilizing in our lives. Any questions or comments before we jump into the material? All right, perfect. So let's jump straight into the myths. And that is myth number 1, that an argument, a disagreement, means that there's a problem in the relationship. And you have this all the time, especially in young couples, whether it's young teenagers like a boyfriend and girlfriend or young couples that have just got married. The moment that it comes the first or second fight, they're completely losing it. They're saying the whole relationship is falling apart. The whole relationship is flawed. Until they come to eventually realize that that's not the case. That's myth number 1 that we are going to completely get rid of and dispel. And that is just because there is a disagreement does not mean that there's an issue with the relationship. Now, how do we understand that? Very good. Glad you asked. So let's take a look at text number 1a on page 98. And this is as follows. This is a quote from the Medrash, right? So a text from the same era as the Mishnah, and it says as follows. Just as human faces are not identical, so their minds are not alike. Right? And it seems to be a very simple, straightforward idea, and that is that just like we accept the reality that people look different, we accept the reality that people also think different, that perspectives will be different. And that's a reality of the world that we live in. And that's kind of what it's telling us. But there's so much more depth to that idea in and of itself, but that is the concept of disagreement is something which is hardwired into all of creation. That is the way that God created us, just like God created us differently. All of us are walking around with different faces. God also created us with different perspectives. And it's important just to recognize that idea itself. But even more than just the fact that we're hardwired to disagree. This happens that even at times when we do agree, or there's a collaboration and everybody's in agreement, a lot of times it's more of like a general agreement as to an actual agreement, or sometimes it's just a temporary agreement, right? As they say, if you have two people if 2 people in the room are saying or thinking the same thing, one of them is clearly not thinking. And that's just the way it works. We all think differently. We all perceive things differently. And that's the way that God created us. And what's fascinating is the more you start to realize that, the more of a blessing it actually is. And that's because when somebody's comfortable enough to share with you that they disagree with you, it's because they're comfortable enough to actually tell you what they're thinking. Most of the time, when someone's just standing in front of you agreeing with you, there's a slight chance that they just don't want to tell you what they're thinking. And that's why they're not telling it to you. So it's actually a blessing when somebody's comfortable enough to disagree with you. That's number 1. So it doesn't mean that there's a flaw in the relationship. On the contrary, there's actually a silver lining to it. A little bit of a deeper layer within that is Rabbi Morgenstern in text 1b, page 98, says as follows. The Midrash teaches, just as human faces are not identical, so their minds are not alike, which is a quote of what we just read. But the way he flips it and explains it, he's a great sage from the 1800s. And he says as follows: just as you tolerate others despite their looking different from you, so must you tolerate others who think differently from you. In other words, nobody, at least not a healthy person, doesn't walk around and is offended or just feels off at the fact that everybody around me doesn't look like me. How come they don't all look like me? Right? Nobody does that. And there are words and labels for people who do have that issue, but most healthy people do not. And that's because we accept that as a fact and a reality. How come it is that all of a sudden, at the moment somebody thinks something differently or has a different perception than I do, all of a sudden I have to get offended? What's going on here? And what the Talmud is telling us is accept the fact that just like they look different than you, they'll also see things differently than you, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the relationship. They're actually being honest, and that's that, in whatever level of relationship that we're talking about. Yes?
From a management perspective, I would change the word tolerate to encourage. Because if someone else is thinking the same things I am, I don't need them. I already have those ideas.
That's a good point. We're going to get to that a little bit later. But then again, if you're trying to control them, we'll tolerate it, not manage it. So yeah, some people encourage disagreements, which we'll see about that in a little bit. That's a very good point. Okay, so that's myth number one. And that is, just to review that anytime there's a disagreement, it means that there's an issue with the relationship. And the answer is absolutely not. That's false. And then on the contrary, anytime there's a disagreement, this actually means that there's a healthy relationship over here. And that is, everybody is comfortable to be themselves. Everybody is comfortable to share their opinion and their perspective. And with that is going to come disagreement. And there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. Myth number two. And that is, as a Roman poet once put it, love conquers all. Simply put, is that if two people will love each other enough, if two people are committed enough to the relationship with that kind of love, that they'll be able to solve all their problems and all their issues. All right? Is that a myth or a fact? Myth. Very good. Now, the opposite might actually be true, and that is that love might actually get in the way of solving the disagreement. And we'll see why in a moment. And let's take a look at text number 2, but a little bit of background first. There was a great sage, his name was Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva lived in the 1st century of the Common Era. He witnessed the Romans destroy the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. He only started studying Torah at the age of 40. And he was somebody who amassed thousands upon thousands of students. He attracted their minds and their hearts from all over the land of Israel. And he was just a phenomenal sage. However, unfortunately, as we're going to see, his students were struck by a plague. And the Talmud tells us what the reason for their punishment was. And that was, if you take a look at text 2a on page 99. It says Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students, right? So 24,000 students. They did not behave toward each other with respect. And that ultimately led to their downfall. Now, there are a couple of issues with that statement and that idea, and that is as follows. Rabbi Akiva is probably most famous for his teaching, and that is, love your fellow as yourself. And if we're calling these 12,000 pairs, number one, the fact that we're calling them pairs, as opposed to just saying 24,000, means that they were connected to each other. They weren't people who were abusive to each other. They weren't people who disconnected each other and identified as not part of the group. These were people who identified as Rabbi Akiva's students. Rabbi Akiva's, one of his most fundamental teachings were, love another like yourself. How is it possible that they were the ones who couldn't respect each other? How come they were the ones who failed at that, seemingly the basic teaching of their teacher, of show love towards another, and ultimately they were divinely punished due to that? How do we reconcile that idea? So in text 2b on page 101, which we're not going to read through it all right now, but in short, I'm going to give it over to you, and it goes as follows. That there's two concepts that we're dealing with here, and that is, there's love and there's respect. And that is, the students of Rabbi Akiva actually mastered the art of truly loving each other. However, when you love someone so much, there are a couple of outcomes of that, and that is as follows. When you love someone and you see that they have according to you, a bad perception or an invalid perception, there's no way that you're just going to sit there and go, let's agree to disagree. Why? Because usually when you come to the conclusion of an argument of let's just agree to disagree, you're just looking to either walk away from the other person, you're just not interested in having any influence on the other person. However, if you truly love them, you would not want them to be walking around with a bad perception, invalid perception in your eyes. So Rabbi Akiva's students, every time they sat down to study together, and any of them walked away with a different perception than them, because like we said, everybody's going to walk away with a different understanding. They said, but I love the other person so much. I can't let them walk around with that erroneous understanding. I have to show them, prove them that they're wrong in order that they should see things my way. Because obviously, if I understood it one way, I'm right, they're wrong. Now, if I truly love them, I would not want them to walk around having a wrong or misunderstanding. And that's generally why you'll realize that you're more likely to be bothered when somebody close to you makes a mistake than somebody who you have nothing to do with makes a mistake. When your own child or your spouse makes a mistake, it's usually like, hey, come on, you're making yourself look bad. I feel bad for you, right? When it's the other random person doing it, you're just like, oh, who cares? You know, where does that come from? A lack of love. The more you love them, the more you want to correct them. So what happens here is the children of Rabbi Akiva the students of Rabbi Akiva truly mastered, but it's their love that drove them to completely disrespect each other. And that is because respect is not love. Respect is a whole nother category. And that is, to respect is actually distance, right? You see, there's an issue with love, and we discussed this, I think it was in the first lesson, and that is, love can be very selfish. Love can be all about me, right? Like the Baron who loved pike, who loved the fish. And Baron who loved how fish made them feel. And that is, there are a lot of times our love can be suffocating. Our love can completely take over the other person. So we have to introduce another component to every relationship. Love is not just not enough. Love is good because it gets us to care. But respect also allows us to create space between us and them to recognize that they are not me and that they can see things different than I can. They can do things differently than I can. You know, I don't have to correct everything that they do because maybe they have their own method in doing it, and maybe I don't think it should be done that way, but they certainly do. Love will not allow me to allow that to go. Respect allows me to see it, identify it, to, maybe that's their thing and maybe that's the way they do it. And if it works, let it be. If it's an understanding and a perception that they have, even though I don't agree, but they're different than me. Maybe they see things different than me, and that's okay because I respect them as something outside of me, not just my all-consuming love. Okay, and that's what Rabbi Akiva's students lacked in that area of being able to create that distance, create that respect that somebody else might see something different than I do. And again, this is across the spectrum, whether it's parents and children, spouses, colleagues, even just random people walking down the street or neighbors, to be able to bring that element of respect, that you can have your opinion, I can have mine. It doesn't mean that I'm right and you're wrong. It doesn't mean that you're right and I'm wrong. It's the ability to identify that there are different perspectives on the same matter. Okay. All right. Now, in order to appreciate, or a video that illustrates kind of this idea, let's take a look.
Each Friday before sunset, Jewish homes glow with candles lit in honor of Shabbat. The Talmud states that these lights bring peace to the home. But what's the connection between light and peace? The Maharal of Prague explained this link through the etymology of two Hebrew words. Boker, that's Hebrew for morning. The root of boker means examine and discern. Erev, that's Hebrew for evening. The root of erev means mixture. These roots make sense. Morning light helps us examine distinctions and discern boundaries. like noticing where the landing ends and the steps begin. In contrast, the darkness of evening blurs distinctions, causing the blending of objects, like putting a fork in the wrong drawer. While blending things might seem harmonious, it can quickly lead to chaos. On the other hand, using light to distinguish between things might sound like disunity, but it creates harmony. It prevents one entity from invading another's space. That's genuine peace. Now let's apply this to relationships. A relationship in the light means recognizing and respecting the other person as a distinct personality with unique thoughts and preferences. We may not always agree, but we honor their feelings, consider their opinions, and respect their wants, understanding that God designs each personality for a unique mission in life. This in the light recognition fosters mutual harmony. A relationship in the dark is when we fail to recognize and respect that the other person is a distinct individual with unique ways of thinking. It's when we see personalities as accidents rather than God's design for a unique mission in this world. This leads to disregarding feelings, negating opinions, and ignoring wants. In this darkness, we invade each other's space, leading to even darker consequences. Now you know why Shabbat candles are conducive to peaceful relationships. Those physical lights remind us to switch on our conceptual lights in our relationships. When each side creates space for the other, they can happily share space. When they respect their differences, they can also focus on their similarities. When they allow for mutual autonomy, they can discover harmony. Shabbat Shalom.
All right. So just to review that point, and that was myth number 2. That is that love conquers all. And the answer is absolutely not. We need to introduce respect to the relationship in order to create that space, each one retaining their own identity in whatever the dynamics is. Again, parents, child, spouses, colleagues, or whatever it might be. Everybody must be able to retain their identity. It doesn't mean that we all have to agree, but at least enough respect to identify. You have your opinion, I have my opinion, you have your perspective, I have my perspective. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. All right. With that, let's jump into myth number 3. And that is that every issue that we disagree upon, we must sit, we must talk until we resolve it. Don't go to bed before the issue is resolved. No one's walking out of this room until the issue is resolved. And many people have that perspective. And the answer, or really the reality of that is, that's a myth. You don't have to deal with every issue under the sun. You don't have to deal with every issue that we disagree with. Sometimes you have to say, let's just talk about something else. And there might be something good that comes out of that, as we shall see. Let's take a look at text number 3 on page 102. Okay. So the story is from a rabbi, his name is Rabbi Shmuel Lu. He's still alive and well. He's one of the Rebbe's emissaries, one of the emissaries of Chabad to London, England. Actually, I think Rabbi Rappaport worked with him for a while when they were living in London. And he says as follows: on the day after Simchas Torah in 1974, the Rebbe asked me if recently I had heard from a certain person, a communal figure in England. I said that as a matter of fact, I had. I added that I had heard that this person had very strongly criticized the Rebbe. This was on a lot of political issues, especially to do with the land of Israel going on at the time. The Rebbe told me the reason for this person's harsh statements was that somebody had misinformed him about what the Rebbe had said about him in a public talk. As a result, this person believed that the Rebbe had attacked him personally, but said the Rebbe, I do not speak about personalities, I speak about ideas. As the Rebbe was saying this, I decided within a split second that as soon as I returned to England, I would make an appointment with this communal figure and straighten things out. As I was thinking it, at that very moment, the Rebbe said, it's not a good idea for you to tell him that I told you about this. Now, unfortunately, I'm a little bit of a wise guy. So I immediately figured out a way around it. I thought, I won't do it, but I'll get somebody else to do it. I was desperate to clear things up so that this person shouldn't have a negative feeling about the Rebbe. But again, as I was thinking this was within a split second, the Rebbe said, and it's not a good idea for you to ask somebody else to go speak with him. The point is that there are 613 commandments in the Torah. If this person will not work with us on this one mitzvah, let him work with us on the other 612. He then explained to me how to become close with this person and how to befriend him. He described how positive this man and his family were and how they could be forces for good. And to me, this became a directive for life in general. Look for the unifying force, always. Look for that which you have in common with the other person and build on that. And it's such a powerful idea because so much of the time we get caught up in our differences. We get caught up in the areas that we don't agree, and we don't even realize that we agree on more things than we disagree. You know, people like to talk about the Talmud and how the Talmud is full of dispute of the sages. And there's a truth to that, and we're going to actually address that in a little bit. However, what people don't realize is that for every dispute there is in the Talmud, there's at least 100 items that outweigh that one dispute that we do agree on. And it's so important to realize that so much of the time we're so focused on what we disagree about, and therefore every time we see that person, again, whether it's a person in our intimate circles or a person in our transactional part of our life, wherever we just meet them or wherever it might be, is we seem to just focus on the areas that we disagree about. Why can't we just focus on the areas that we do agree? Actually, there is a teaching in the Talmud which says as follows, that we owe a debt of gratitude to the nations of the world for bringing actors into their theaters and circuses to entertain the crowds, ensuring that the people don't converse one with the other and come to senseless conflict with each other. And that sometimes we just need a little bit of entertainment. We just need a sports team to follow and that we can both agree on, and everyone's happy. All of a sudden, all of the politics that we were fighting about and all the little petty issues or the bigger issues that we seemingly could not have disagreed on, let's just turn on the game and we'll both be happy. And you have that so much of the time, and especially in close relationships. For some reason, we feel like we have to just pick on that one issue that we disagree on. And that just irritates it over and over and over and doesn't allow either party to truly grow, doesn't allow us to come, because all we can do is nitpick at that which we don't agree on. Why don't we take a breath, take a step back, and let's look at all the areas that we do appreciate, that we do enjoy, that we do agree on, and let's grow from there. As the Rebbe said, right, this public figure wouldn't work with Chabad on one issue. It's okay. There are 612 other issues that we can work on together, and that's fine. If we get to those 612, then we get to the 613. And let's go through everything else, and then we'll come to that last one when we can. All right. Now, in short, just to summarize the three myths that we have busted, and that is, number one, when there's a disagreement, no need for panic, no need to be alarmed. It doesn't mean that the relationship is over. On the contrary, it might actually be that the relationship now has more openness to it in the sense that we're actually sharing what we think and what we feel. That's number one. Number two, love won't conquer it all. Love will not do it. We need to have respect. When we can respect the other person, just the fact that they see things differently, that in itself is already enough to diffuse the disagreement from being a fight. So now we're just disagreeing, and that's okay. And then thirdly, sometimes you just got to leave it alone. Sometimes you just got to move past it or focus on something else because we may never resolve this. It actually, that third point reminds me of, there's a couple, I think it's John and Julie Gottman. They have what's called the Gottman Institute. It's a relationship research center, I think in Seattle. And they put on some fascinating books on relationships, couples, marriage, everything. And you know, they have these apartments, like talking about hundreds of apartments, and they've really observed or a couple of thousand, tens of thousands of couples, just for days, weeks, months on end, just to understand different little things from relationships and how to really, get to the science of what makes a good relationship, what doesn't make a good relationship. Just a fascinating couple. And one of the things that they write is that in the beginning of your marriage, there are certain things that you're going to fight about, and you have to realize you might fight about these things till death do us part. There are certain differences that you have, and the quicker you learn what those differences are, and the quicker you pick up on them, the happier your marriage will be, because you'll realize I don't need to get caught up in the conflict of the fact that we don't agree on these issues. Like she says about that, they write about themselves that I think one of them likes camping, another one loves the city. And so this is something that really early on in our marriage, we came to accept that we're never going to agree that one is better than the other, because one of us has one perspective, the other one has the other, and we're constantly going to fight about that every single year when it comes time to go on vacation. Should we be going hiking and camping, or should we be going to a nice hotel in the city? And we'll have to figure that out, but we're never going to resolve that disagreement. There are other areas and little issues that will come up, or bigger issues that will come up, that you will have to, face head on. It's like, I remember my grandfather, blessed memory, right after I got engaged, one of his tidbits for relationship was learn how to fight nicely. Right? You have to be able to disagree with the other person without being disagreeable, without breaking the entire relationship, because that's just going to be reality. And sometimes that might mean ignoring that one issue, because it might continuously come up and it might never be resolved, and maybe it never needs to be resolved. But it's important to keep that in mind. Okay. Any questions before we continue to understand this, or take this to a little bit of a deeper level? All right, so let's dive right in. Okay, so let's dive right in, and that is, we're going to take a little bit of a Torah perspective, and until this point, you can argue that disagreement is a flaw. But we want to take this from the point that disagreement is a flaw to come to an understanding and a perspective that maybe disagreement is actually a feature. Maybe it's actually something positive and good. And for that, let's jump straight into it. And as follows. When the Bible accounts the 6 days of creation, and then God rested on the seventh day. So at the end of each day, God said something. That was, at the end of the first day, God said, and it was good, right? God created the world, started to create the world, and God said it was good. On the second day, it doesn't say, and it was good. It says that God created by separating the higher waters and the lower waters, because at that point, the entire world was just engulfed in water, and God separated the waters. But it doesn't say anywhere that it was good. All of a sudden, on the third day, which would happen on the third day, is that dry land emerged from the water, and the inhabited world, as we know, became inhabitable. And then it says it was good twice. Okay. So the Talmud, the Medrash, asks as follows. Let's take a look at text 4 on page 105. Says the Midrash, why doesn't the Torah report it was good on the second day? Right? What happened? Did it skip it? Because when it continues, the fourth, fifth, and sixth day also all have, and it was good, because they were all products of creation. So why is it the second day doesn't have, and it was good? So Rabbi Hanina taught, division was created on that day, as it is stated, quote from Genesis, let there be a separation between water and water. Rabbi Tavyomi taught, if God declined to declare an act of division necessary for the planet's betterment as good, how much more so regarding division among people that inflicts disturbance on the world? Right? So God is unequivocally announcing that this kind of separateness, this kind of division is no good. And that's why every other day of creation got the stamp of approved, it was good, it passed the quality test. The second day, God did not give his stamp of approval. God did not give the stamp of it was good. Now, to better understand this, what this passage is telling us, that when God created the world, on the second day when God created division, he wasn't just creating the division between the waters in order for the land to come out, in order for it to be dry land, but God was actually creating all forms of division that would exist forever. And that is, just like everything that exists in this world must have been created in one form or another by God, the idea of conflict, the idea of disagreement, was also a creation by God. And when did God create that? On the second day of creation. But at the same time, God was saying that this is no good, and that's why in the account and the narrative of creation, it doesn't say that it was good. But then you think about it and say, okay, I get it that conflict is no good. Nobody likes conflict. But then why, on the third day, does it say, and it was good twice? Seeming that, and it was good twice on the third day, is to make up for what we missed out on the second day. So is division and conflict a good thing, or is it a bad thing? And if it's a bad thing, how did it get the, hey, good job on the third day? Okay. So to better understand this, the Zohar tells us as follows. On a simple level, the way it can be understood is that one, when it comes to one, there's only one thing that could be there, which in that case, what are we talking about? A reality of godliness, a reality of spirituality. And that is day one. All that exists is heaven. All that exists is the spirit. Two, which means now we're no longer dealing with one. There are now two players that have been introduced. There's now been a split. This split and the conflict represents that split and that conflict between spirit and matter, between physical and spiritual, between creator and creation. Now there's conflict. Now there's division. But comes along day three. Day three represents reconciliation. The ability to bring the spirit and matter, physical and spiritual, back together. Creator and creation can now come to re-experience their original union. And that is like this. When you have one person in a room, is there any need for conflict resolution? I hope not. Right? Generally, although so they say that we came up with philosophy that is just a way of arguing with ourselves. But when you have just one reality, one identity, one opinion, you don't need conflict resolution. The moment you introduce number two, the moment you introduce something else, you now need to be able to resolve a conflict, because now there's a potential for conflict at the point that you have two in the room. Like we said, there's always going to be two. The idea of number three is how to resolve that, which in the case of creation, as we said, day number one represents there's no reality that exists outside of spirit, outside of God's purpose of creation. Comes along day two, creates now a disconnect. There's a schism. There's now spirit and there's matter. There's the soul and there's the body. There are now two powers at play that are right now seemingly conflicting. Comes along the third day, and the third day represents the capacity for dry land, which would eventually be the place where Adam and Eve would be carved out of, and human beings would come along to resolve that conflict, as human beings containing both a body and a soul, spirit and matter, physical and spiritual, in order to reconcile the difference. Those differences between the spiritual and the physical, the creator and the creation, to bring them back together. And with that, the Zohar says, that's why on the third day, God says twice, and it was good. Because now we can appreciate that until now, when you only have one opinion and nobody's arguing with you and you can't reconcile, it's meaningless. But the moment that you can have two opinions that are opposing and you can come to a point of reconciliation, that makes the first opinion that much more powerful because it has been reconciled. And with this, one of the great sages known as the Moral of Prague, the way he points it out when it comes to the numbers, it essentially seems like we're just dealing with numbers, right? One alone doesn't really do us much. The problem is once you have two, there is no way to bring two together on their own. And this would basically be an illusion of an idea of the number two. However you're going to put it, you will not be able to bring the two completely together. But the moment you introduce the third element, you have now created a place of unity for all components that are at play. And based on that idea, what we'll call it is a harmony. And that is, if you can only have your opinion when you're alone, and you can't have an opinion when you're amongst others, that is not unity. That is not harmony. Harmony is when you can have different opinions and they can all get along, when they can all create a bigger picture, when there can be reconciliation between the fight, when there can be togetherness after that split. Okay. Now, so just to review some lessons that we can take away from the creation narrative, and then we'll put this all back together to understand really what this idea of reconciliation is and how to bring it back to the idea of disagreement. So number one that we saw is that conflict itself is woven into the very fabric of creation. And the way that we saw that was day 2, when God himself created conflict. We also saw that conflict itself is a negative phenomenon, as God himself did not give the stamp of approval on day 2. However, if we can navigate the conflict properly and have some kind of positive results at the end, reconciliation, then there is some kind of redemptive factor to that idea. And ultimately, reconciliation can actually lead to a deeper connection than there was in the first place, which is what we're going to explore in just a moment. Okay. To illustrate this idea and to understand it a little bit deeper, let me tell you a story about 2 great sages who lived quite a while ago. Right? These are sages of the Talmud, so we're talking about the 2nd century. And it goes as follows. There was one sage, his name was Rabbi Yochanan. Another sage was Rish Lakish. Both of these 2 young boys grew up in the same city, but had led very different lives. Rabbi Yochanan became one of the greatest scholars of his generation. Rish Lakish became one of the biggest gangsters of his generation. And the story goes that Rabbi Yochanan was once bathing in the river, and Rabbi Yochanan had, as the Talmud describes, he had beautiful hair, and he was very pretty. And Rish Lakish thought that there was a woman bathing in the water, and he approached, and when he saw it was Rabbi Yochanan, he was a little surprised that it was Rabbi Yochanan, that it was a man. And he said, "Your beauty belongs to that of women, as you're too beautiful to be you." So he said, "Your strength belongs to Torah, not to being a gangster." Anyways, Rabbi Yochanan brought Rish Lakish under his wing. Rish Lakish became a great scholar on his own, and he gave up his ways of being a gangster. Not only that, Rish Lakish ends up marrying Rabbi Yochanan's sister. It gets even better. It's a real love story. It gets even better, and that is Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish actually became study partners. And they would love to study for hours together. But don't think for a moment that they agreed on anything. Later after the class, you can take a look at the extra writings on this lesson, where it goes through just several of their disputes, but there are well over 100 disputes throughout the Talmud between the 2 of them and how they could not agree on pretty much anything. But it's just fascinating to see, and I'll tell you why. Let's take a look at text number 6 on page 109. And the Talmud tells us as follows. When Rish Lakish passed away, Rabbi Yochanan grieved terribly. The sages told each other who should visit him to provide comfort. Let Rabbi Elazar ben Padat go, for he is a brilliant scholar, right? So right now Rabbi Yochanan is grieved because his brother-in-law, his study partner, Rish Lakish, had passed away. So Rabbi Elazar ben Padat went and sat before Rabbi Yochanan. To each idea that Rabbi Yochanan taught, Rabbi Elazar ben Padat responded, "I know of an earlier teaching that supports your opinion." Right? In English, I think we call that an echo chamber. Right? So for everything that he said, he brought him a teaching which supports that idea. He was just agreeing and validating to every teaching that came out of his mouth. Rabbi Yochanan exclaimed, "Are you supposed to be like Rish Lakish? In my discussions with Rish Lakish, whenever I would share a viewpoint, he would raise 24 objections, and I would be forced to deliver 24 responses. As a result of our intense give and take, the entire subject was crystallized. You, however, constantly tell me there is an earlier teaching that supports your opinion. Do I not already know that my ideas are sound?" Rabbi Yochanan went about in grief. He tore his clothes, wept, and called out, "Where are you, Rish Lakish? Where are you, Rish Lakish?" And it's just fascinating to see. This is so contrary to what you see in modern societies. Every time somebody agrees with me, the only thing I can do is scream and shout and cancel them, as opposed to, no, let's accept disagreement. Rabbi Yochanan is sitting here and he's grieving. Why is he grieving? Because he lost his study partner, not the one who validates and just echoes back to him everything that he said, but the one who would not let him get away with a single statement without challenging it from every single aspect and every single angle. And it's a beautiful idea, and that is to understand that the idea of argument and disagreeing is actually healthy. Because when we do that, we can crystallize the idea to come to a true understanding. If your ideas never get challenged, if you're too scared to verbalize your idea because there's going to be a challenge to it, then how do you know that there's anything valuable in your idea on its own? Until an idea is challenged, until you can challenge an opinion, who says that it's fully thought out? And maybe there is something that I didn't think of. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan was so distraught. And that is the great value in the idea of disagreement. Because disagreement can bring us closer in the sense that closer to the truth. We can understand the concept a lot better. Until you can do that, right? So how do you sharpen a blade? Is you need to smack it against another piece of metal. If you have nothing to smack it against, and the blade just gets duller and duller and duller, and all of a sudden you're just spewing out ideas that you have no idea if they make any sense in the first place because you won't allow for them to be challenged. Now, let's unpack that idea a little bit further. And that is, let's take a look at text number 7 on page 111. And with this idea, we can understand a little bit how there's actually going to be a deeper relationship here as a result of the conflict, not despite the conflict. Please, doctor. Please.
The Almighty deliberately created humans with diverse perspectives, although that allows the possibility that due to differing opinions, humans could wind up not treating each other with respect. Obviously, God's intention in creating people this way was not to enable conflict, but its exact opposite, to facilitate a superior unity that emerges on the heels of division, the advantage of the number 3. The presence of multiple opinions yields multiple fresh points and ideas. Each individual contributes from their unique intellect, eventually leading to a better conclusion and decision. When different individuals with dissimilar perspectives discuss a matter jointly, without any individual suppressing or forfeiting their viewpoint, or that would contradict the nature imbued in us by God, the matter can be viewed from several angles, leading to a truer conclusion than any single viewpoint. Needless to say, if parties set this as their goal, they will conduct their discussion peacefully and with mutual respect.
Thank you. Now, to illustrate this idea, I hope this works. So first of all, the point that the Rebbe is making in that paragraph is that on the contrary, so the relationship between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, the fact that they disagreed was not a potential impediment to the relationship, and despite their disagreeing, they had a healthy relationship. But on the contrary, it was because of their disagreements themselves that actually created a greater relationship. It brought them closer because they were able to challenge each other's ideas in order to come to a place of truth. And it was coming from a place of truth. It was coming from a healthy way to disagree. Because like that, we can crystallize the idea and create a much closer connection between the two. And that exists on all levels. But just to illustrate this idea, I hope that the technology will not fail me on this, but to bring out something so beautiful, and that is, all right, I spent, let's see, from 14 to about 10 years in yeshiva, in the study halls of the yeshiva. Now, the study halls of yeshiva are nothing like you've ever seen. Usually when you walk into a study hall, you expect there to be silence. You expect each person to be sitting on their own, culling through books, coming up with ideas and jotting them down. That's not how your yeshiva looks. But for that, I'll let you appreciate this.
The second thing I learned in Judaism is how to argue, debate, disagree, say no to each other, fight, argue again and again and again.
No, but it doesn't make sense. Because the whole point of saying that retroactively it works is only if it doesn't have a serious because you're eventually going to realize that you lost it, and then you're going to be my
They're not actually fighting. They're just studying. I have never seen such a thing.
There are bad arguments and there are good arguments. Bad arguments are, I hate you, I want to put you down, I want to enforce my opinion and my values on you. Good arguments is, I want to fight it out with you so that we can both come to the truth and we can come closer to each other through the argument. And Jews love a good argument.
The way Jews study is done in pairs of two who are supposed to debate religion. It's called Chavruta, which comes from the word friend, chaver. Does anybody here get offended by somebody disagreeing with you and telling you you're wrong?
No, because the goal is the same team all the time. No, you
On the same team.
You get excited. The goal is mutual understanding.
In Judaism, debating is part of the religion, and no one gets killed or harmed for having a different opinion.
So it's two friends getting together to fight each other, but fight for the truth. And when we finished and we close our books, then we shake hands and we have a hug and we go and eat together and pray together.
Some people say if you put two Jews in a room, you get three opinions. This is funny, but it's actually a good thing. The more you disagree, the closer you get to the truth.
Jews like to argue because we are completely devoted and committed to finding the truth.
And maybe that is why 22% of Nobel Prizes go to Jewish scientists.
Because of these two major factors, the culture of arguing for the truth and the drive to improve the world and make it a better place, put those two things together, you're going to win lots of Nobel Prizes.
That's a lot of them.
A lot of them. Baruch Hashem. Thank God.
Right. 2 points. Yes, that's what yeshiva was like. You're talking about 10 years of sitting across from somebody, arguing out, reading texts, challenging each other, going to listen to a lecture, and then just challenging the one who gave the lecture. I think it was my 5th year in LA, there was a rule that you couldn't come to the lecture if you and your study partner have not come up with your own series of questions on the subject matter that we were learning that wasn't discussed by the commentaries. And his point was, if you didn't come up with your own questions, you weren't thinking about the ideas, you weren't challenging the ideas, you weren't looking or interested in what you were about to explore and discover. So if somebody made a statement in front of you and your wheels didn't start spinning going, wait, maybe there's something wrong with that. Not because there's something wrong with them, but because we're on a quest for truth over here. We're on a quest for commitment to the ideas at hand. And therefore, they were meant to be challenged. When you questioned the teacher and you were able to make a good point, that was something which was respected, because that meant that you were thinking and you came up with a different viewpoint. And the more viewpoints we can come up with, the closer we can come to the truth of the subject at hand. Now, it's important to realize, and somebody should tell this to everybody who comes out of the yeshiva, that now that you're in the real world, not necessarily you're supposed to carry that around. You're not necessarily supposed to come home every night and that every time your wife says something, ooh, I got this. We're on this quest for truth here, right? But the point of this is, where does disagreement, first of all, where can there be positive disagreement? And where does positive disagreement stem from? And it's this idea that if we're looking for truth and it's coming from a place of truth, it'll lead to a place of truth. That's number one. Number two, it's not about disagreeing with the other person. We're dealing with ideas here. And therefore, it's okay to disagree, as long as we started off with, that there is respect and we're able to appreciate the other person. And it's not about them or me. It's about we. It's about what we're exploring. Okay. Now, in order to be able to do that in a healthy way and to really, tackle that and to really come to it from a healthy perspective, and that every disagreement should not lead to an argument, that every disagreement should not lead into a fight and to discord, we have to go back to one of the underlying drivers that we've been using in each lesson, and that is our two friends, the souls. And that is, when you have a disagreement or an argument that is based on mutual growth, it'll always end up in a healthy place. And that included in that is even between husband and wife, between parents and children. And that's because we're not going to be arguing for the sake of arguing. If there's ever a disagreement that does come up, we'll be cognizant, first of all, if it's appropriate or not, because if you're looking for mutual growth, you will not bring up the argument every time the other person talks, because that's not looking for mutual growth. But if it's about ego, then it's always, I gotta be right. And if it's all about me being right, the moment you have an opinion that's a challenge to my opinion, the moment you come up with an idea that's a challenge to my idea, and that puts me on my heels, that makes me defensive, and now all of a sudden this little disagreement turns out into an all-out war. And where is that coming from? And that is, as we said before, the godly soul. The godly soul, like we said, is not needy, rather needed, is not scared, rather calm. It's not looking to defend itself because it's here for the purpose of the mission. It doesn't feel threatened. And therefore, it's always at ease and is always looking for, like we said, purpose and mission, which is all about the truth. And therefore, the perspective that we're coming from when we're in touch with our godly soul is a perspective of truth, a perspective of growth, a perspective of what is the best that can come out of this. Versus the animal soul, which is always on its heels, always looking to protect the self, the I. It has to be my opinion that's correct. It has to be me that is right. All of a sudden, every disagreement turns into an all-out war, an all-out fight. Why? Because every time that I feel you don't agree with me, that destroys my ego, that destroys me. Which means if you have another opinion that's opposite mine, all of a sudden you're out to get me. So every time you say something that doesn't agree with me or that I didn't come up with, that's an attack against me. And the ego is very sensitive. The animal soul gets very sensitive in this area. And then all of a sudden, we can't have a conversation unless I'm right, or we're all out fighting. And therefore, it's important to go back to that idea of choosing to live from a space of our godly soul over our animal soul, to be able to channel that idea and to be able to accept disagreement without it becoming that war. And then the flip side, when we're able to take it from the godly soul's perspective, it's actually able to bring us to a better place, a place of more truth, a place of closeness, specifically as a result of the disagreement, bringing us back to the idea of the second day of creation, and that the core value of the second day of creation was because it can actually bring us to a place of truth. It can actually bring us to a place where we can crystallize the matter and come closer together as a result of the disagreement. But that's only if done properly from the space of the godly soul, not the place of the animal soul. If done when it's about growth, not about the ego, not about who's right and who's wrong. Any questions or remarks on that? Yes.
And all those guys in yeshiva are studying the Talmud about guys 18 centuries before doing the same thing.
Isn't that funny? We were arguing about what they were arguing about, and they were arguing about what they were arguing about. And that goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. I wonder what the first argument was about. Yes.
I want to save this till later, but I'm gonna just think about something from my life, which is that in medical school, if you question a medical school professor, you might get kicked out of school. There is nothing like this. Okay, this is not reality for a lot of things. All right. So I don't know where that fits in here. I mean, I have no idea, but there are certain places you can question.
Right.
Okay. And that was my experience throughout medical school, throughout medical training. You do not question anybody, all right? Which doesn't help the profession any, but anyway, that's the way it is.
That's
So
blind obedience to authority.
what?
That's blind obedience to authority.
That's what my experience was.
Right.
And that's why, as I heard in the lecture, 78% of physicians in Germany belong to the Nazi party. Blind obedience. That's how they were taught.
Yeah. I once heard that if you look at the history, most airplane crashes, or faultiness in the air actually happened in Asia. And that's because they're extremely obedient, and that the air traffic controllers never had the capacity to question the managers in charge. And because of that, anytime information came through, if the manager didn't agree with them, there was no pushback, and they weren't able to do anything. And some of them, not many of them, but some of them were actually avoidable. But because of that, unfortunately, it happened because of that lack of being able to question and being able to bring up the idea. There was a fellow talking about the Nobel Prizes from before. There's a fellow in Israel who, his name is Daniel Kahneman. He's an Israeli Nobel Prize winner in the field of economics. He created what's called adversarial collaboration, where he'd specifically get professionals in different fields, put them together in a room, and get them to disagree on a subject in order to advance both arenas. So you get like a musician, a physicist, and a philosopher all in the same room. Get them to look at an idea and make sure that they're going to see it differently. And they're all, because professionals in their field, they're going to be strong about their opinions, and that's going to drive them to advancing whatever it is that they're working with. And it's specifically because of their disagreement and their ability to do that.
By the way, this business between a pilot and a controller and the pilot culturally not listening, take exactly as a controller presented it, was solved. They took these pilots and they educated them to question, did not take as a reality what they've been presented. And that reduced the accidents tremendously.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, at the same time, there are arenas where questions are completely inappropriate at the moment, right? Soldiers at war, and a command comes in from the general for this in the group, everybody in the platoon. You must listen to what's being said. So obviously there are times where it's appropriate, times where it's inappropriate, and then there's also how it's appropriate. If it's coming from a place of truth, it will not come with disrespect. And that's why even, let's say, in the yeshiva system, in the Talmud, when you read through how students would question their teachers, it was never in a way of disrespect that you're wrong and I'm right. It was never in a way of attacking. It was done with challenging, at the same time with the utmost respect, which is phenomenal in and of itself. Okay, now that we've gained that perspective, and that hopefully we can see disagreements, and again, in the worlds of ideas, because we're not talking about betrayals or anything of the like, or moral failures, but that we can gain a perspective that there might actually be a value to it, and that there might be something healthy about it, and that we can use that in our different relationships. So let's jump into gaining some practical tips on how to apply that in day-to-day life. So practical tip number one is kind of building off of last week's lesson, and that is listening. We explored last week how important it is to listen. And in the realm of disagreeing, it's so important to actually listen. Hear what the other person is saying. Don't think about how to respond. Don't interrupt them. Fully let them say whatever it is that they're trying to get out. Very simply put, you might actually realize that they're not really disagreeing with you. They're purely saying the same thing as you from a different angle. And it happens all the time. It actually happened to me today. A friend of mine sent me a clip of a certain rabbi in Brooklyn talking, and it was supposed to be a little bit provocative in the sense of, he was making an extreme statement, and my friend sent me, he's like, what's your thoughts on it? So I shared my thoughts, and he shared his thoughts, and at first, I was like, hey, I knew exactly what my friend was going to say, because we don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. And like I said, he's a good friend of mine, and we don't see eye to eye on many things. And I was like, here he goes again. But I was like, I'm going to continue. I'm going to entertain the conversation. This was all via WhatsApp. So in general, WhatsApp is not a great place to have a conversation. You can't hear someone's tone of voice. You can't see their facial expressions. But we do it anyways because it's too much fun. At least with the voice note, once in a while, you get a little bit of a person's expression. But if they're in the middle of doing something else or walking, you can't tell. But anyways, as the conversation continued, I realized we were saying the same exact thing, but from literally opposite perspectives. We were not disagreeing in the slightest, but on the contrary, we're coming at it from just two totally different places, that we were both valuing and appreciating what was being said, but for exactly opposite reasons, which kind of completed the circle of the statement that was being made. But sometimes it's just a matter of actually listening to the other person without getting defensive, without needing to come up with a comeback before they even finish talking, because I already decided I know what you're going to say, and I'm going to already respond to what you even started to say. And it's extremely important, especially in the area that we are disagreeing with someone else, or we know somebody else might have a different opinion on something, actually hear them out. And you might realize that you're not even disagreeing, or at least even if they are disagreeing, at least you'll hear them. So that's just jumping back into some of the skills that we already have from before. But a second component to that is as follows. And that's more on the passive side, or active listening, but passively. But then there's the next state, and that is whatever is going to come out of me in this conversation. And that is, let's take a look at text number 8 on page 114, and this is from Ecclesiastes.
Text number 9.
8, please.
Softly spoken words of the wise are heard louder than the roars of foolish rulers.
Thank you. And that is when you're having a conversation with somebody, if you want them to truly hear you, it's not about raising your voice, right? Whoever screams louder wins. Whoever says a sharper word to the other person wins. Yeah, if you're fighting from a place of ego and you're fighting from a place where I need to be right, they need to be wrong, you might go down that path, but it's foolish for so many reasons. It's foolish because there's nothing good that's going to come out of that conversation. And something I wanted to mention before about difference in approaching the disagreement or the dispute from a place of ego and the animal soul, from a place of humility and the godly soul. And that is, how many times have you ever sat down at a conversation or walked into a meeting thinking, I'm hoping my opinion is going to be changed, or I'm even open to my opinion being changed as a result of this meeting, as a result of this confrontation, as a result of this dispute? How many times has that happened? How many people walk into a meeting looking for their own minds to be changed? Most people walk in there, they barge in there, and they're like, all right, who can I steamroll? Right? Whose mind am I going to change? Whose opinion am I going to change? Because none of you are going to change my mind. But no, that's not what it's about. If it's about truth and if it's about being real, and especially, again, we're talking about the way that we're going to relate to a spouse, a parent, a child, somebody we work with. It's not necessarily about winning. And even if we do want to bring out a certain idea and a certain value, and we want them to hear it, if you truly want them to hear it, you're not going to walk in with harsh words and screaming, as he says, like the foolish ruler, but rather it will be heard in a soft tone. It'll be said with a soft tone. There's how loud we say it, there's the tone that we use, and then there's the words that we use. And these are all important ideas that if we're actually trying to communicate an idea of truth, coming to a place of mutual growth, and that who knows whose mind will be changed. Because hopefully, if we do this correctly, we're going to be in a truer place than both of us were before we walked into this room or walked into this argument or this disagreement. So let's be open to hearing each other out. You know, it's a husband and wife who want to talk about how to discipline the children. He's more hardline, she's more about, gentle parenting. And that's good, but let them communicate about that, and let's find the values between being a hardline parent and a gentle parent. And maybe we can find some way to balance the two. Or maybe neither of us need to change the way that we do it, and both of us just need to be on the same page about the way that we want to parent, or whatever it might be in whatever scenario and situation you want to apply this to. But the way that things are said, the tones that are used, and the words that are going to be used are extremely crucial to the result of that conversation. Doctor, let's read text number 9, please.
Talking tentatively simply means that we tell our story as a story, rather than disguising it as a hard fact. Perhaps you are unaware, suggests that you're not absolutely certain. In my opinion, says you're sharing an opinion and no more. When sharing a story, strike a blend between confidence and humility. Share in a way that expresses appropriate confidence in your conclusions, while demonstrating that, if called for, you want your conclusion challenged. To do so, change. The fact is to, in my opinion. Swap, everyone knows that, for I've talked to 3 of our suppliers who think that. So often, it's clear to me, too, I'm beginning to wonder if. Why soften the message? Because we're trying to add meaning to the fool, not force it down people's throats. If we're too forceful, the information won't make it into the pool. One of the ironies of dialogue is that when talking with those holding opposing opinions, the more convinced and forceful you act, the more resistant others become. Speaking in absolute and overstated terms does not increase your influence, it decreases it. The converse is also true. The more tentatively you speak, the more open people become to your opinion.
And you can thank you. You can take a look at on page 116 in figure 3.5, some forceful phrases and forceful words which are commonly used, that maybe if we can look for softer ways of using the same idea, communicating, do not change our message, but change the method of delivery. And what's interesting is we see this approach in the way that many of the rabbis and sages throughout history have spoken. Let's take a look at page 117 in text number 10. This is from Rabbi Chizkiyahu of Medini, a 19th century sage, and he writes as follows. It is common for halachic authorities to state their opinion with a term of moderation, which means efshar, meaning perhaps this is so. Nevertheless, subsequent halachic authorities will proceed to cite such an opinion as the unequivocal view of the earlier sage, omitting the modification, and they will base their ruling on the stated opinion. This is done because efshar does not necessarily imply doubt. Rather, it's an unpretentious way to express oneself. And it's important to realize that in a conversation that you're having with somebody, if you see that every time you make a hardline statement that they get pushed away, to soften the way that we're trying to communicate the message. And again, whether it's parenting children, spouses, colleagues, or whatever it might be, and like that, at least the ideas that we're communicating will be heard, will be listened to. Okay. A general guideline for constructive dialogue, you can take a look at page 118. We're not going to go through all 15 steps right now, but an important tool to be able to carry around. So in your free time, if you want to take a look at that as a guiding rules to those types of dialogues. Now, the big question is like this, and one of the big issues, and that is, what if the person who I am talking to, who I'm having a dialogue with, who I'm having a disagreement with, is not playing by the same rules that I am? Right? So I'm approaching it, I want to come in soft, I want to come in caring, I want to come in listening, but I know that in the past they haven't shown up to these conversations with such a perspective. Or it might be that we're in the middle of one of these dialogues, one of these disagreements, and they're not playing by these rules. What do I do then? So do I just revert to fighting them at their game, and then it's just two dogs barking at each other and nobody's listening? So with this, let's take some more out of the wisdom of King Solomon, text number 11 on page 120. And he says as follows: as water mirrors a face, so does one human heart reflect another. And there's really two ideas that he's communicating here. Idea number one is, it's known as emotional reciprocity. Emotional reciprocity means that when you're sitting down and talking to somebody, if you will begin to become heated, angry, frustrated, or anything of the like, it's contagious. And they will respond the same way, even if at that moment they were not heated yet, even if they were just on the brink of it, or even less than that. They will respond to you the same way that you show up emotionally. But just like that works for the negative, that also works for the positive. When you show up to the conversation with a calm demeanor, with a caring, listening ear, and you're showing them respect, and you're showing them patience, and you're calm, they will reciprocate that. So even though you know that in the past they haven't, or even in the moment that they might not be there, but you can actually bring them back down into that conversation to do it in a healthy way. That's number one. Number two, and we're going to see more about this in lesson 4 and 5, and that is, we're all human beings. And, again, and you have the godly soul and the animal soul, two very different perspectives, and that is, so to say, being the bigger person. And sometimes it might feel like there's always demand. Why do I always have to be the bigger person? Why can't they, for once, be the bigger person? Now, that might sound like a justified claim, at least in the world of the animal soul. And in the world of the animal soul, yeah. And I'm willing to be a bigger person because even the animal soul can agree and admit that sometimes we need to be the bigger person to get the better outcome. But the animal soul eventually gets fed up being the bigger person because it says, why am I the one who always has to be the bigger person in order for there to be a proper outcome? The godly soul doesn't look at it that way. The godly soul says, great, I get to be the bigger person. Because the godly soul is always looking to transcend. The godly soul is always looking to be able to move forward. It's always looking for, how do we get past ego? How do we get past the fight? So it looks at this as an opportunity. Yeah, the other person might not be able to be the bigger person ever. Is that a flaw within me? On the contrary, no. That means that I do have the capacity to be the bigger person. But along with that is, maybe the other person is just having a bad day. Or maybe the other person just grew up in a home or grew up in an environment where they never saw healthy conflict. So to them, anytime that there's conflict, it either means they have to completely retrieve and the conversation's over, or they have to fight, because those are the only two modes of conflict that they ever learned, that they were ever exposed to. They never heard of this idea. And until you're able to show them what healthy conflict looks like, they may never learn how or know that such a concept is even possible. And yeah, it may take being the bigger person, but that's called investing in the relationship. And once again, whether it's a spouse, child, parent, coworker, neighbor, and if we're actually going to care about this relationship, we're going to be willing to invest and show up as the bigger person so that they can learn and be able to mirror that back and be able to come to a place where we could have healthy conflict. So I guess in the spirit of healthy conflict, let's have healthy conflict, no unhealthy conflict, to be able to come to places of truth, to be able to come closer together. And like that, we're able to really come closer in the face of disagreeing, because remember, we are not meant to always agree. Doesn't mean that we have to fight or be disagreeable. And that concludes tonight's lesson. Please God, next week we are on for Tuesday night as well, and that will be about imbuing our relationships with more positivity. Thank you for joining tonight. Yes, any questions or comments?
Well, so the last couple sentences you said was about a family perspective. What if you have never seen people, disagreeing in a healthy